Hey guys, Luton here. We are back for some more Below the Line. Sorry this is a day late, just one of those weeks. Right, last time we were talking about the price of games. Should we be paying more? Should we be paying less? Is it right? Where are we at with the pricing of games, especially around the debate about microtransactions, whether they're required? Should games have gone up in price in regards to things like inflation? Whiskey Tango Foxtrot, he says the market dictates the prices. Right now games are priced the way they are because there are so many alternatives. If you price your game release at a base price of $100, you're already limiting your market share in an already crowded market. Someday I'm sure games will eventually go up to that price point, but as it stands today, are you sure? But why would I waste my time spending that much money for a game when I got better options elsewhere? This is kind of what I was talking about there. I was saying about how it should have potentially gone up over time. But like I say, I also have some other people I'm going to be speaking to about this very soon. He says, if Arma 4 was to come out next week with all the things that the Arma 3 community could ever want in an Arma game, sure, maybe I'd be willing to pay that amount, but only because I love hardcore sim games. I have a level of trust when it comes to Bohemia, for example, and their games. However, ask the average gamer to pay that kind of price tag for a casual shooter they may or may not even like. That's a much harder sell. It's a good point to make, and you know, I think this is really the issue as well, is that there are a lot of levels of different games. You know, there's a lot of detail, a lot of different genres, and not only do you have different communities around those games, but you have different age ranges, different demographics, different longevity expectations, different expectations for the amount of detail you're going to see in a game. All of these kind of, the length of support that a game is going to be supported for. Is it kind of a thing that's, you know, a year then move on, or is it a thing that you want to see it, you know, like Arma, see it supported for like 4 years and still more? This is the thing that we struggle with. You know, it's like the details are far and wide ranging. That's why everyone is always asking, is a game worth a price? There isn't really a kind of accepted price point, except maybe for these AAA games, which it seems to be the default price, which is expected is about 60. But why is it just expected at 60? Why is it that we just like, oh, AAA game, that's $60, you know? And I know British, but you know, everyone just kind of knows that price point, about $60, it's about 45, 50 quid, right? Why do we just accept by default that is the price? You know, I mean, when you see stuff like Senua's Sacrifice, which is technically a kind of indie, maybe mid-level kind of game, much cheaper, and yeah, that was a kind of single-player experience that you wouldn't necessarily consume much more after. There's not a huge amount of replayability there, but nonetheless, the quality of the game is there. But I suppose, again, you're looking at the hours you put into that game. That's a game that you can run for about 6-7 hours only, similarly to about Firewatch. So again, then you're about that kind of £20 price point. I don't know, but my question really is just like, it's a strange thing to have products which can vary very greatly in playtime, longevity, content, and yet it's just accepted almost like, oh yeah, this is the base price and we don't really see it move from that. I think that's weird. Okay, Warner says, I don't see what the problem with Season Pass or DLC is. Never have, never will. If I like a core game, I want to tell the company I'll stick around and play for another year, I'll do it. But I don't want to pay that up front with the £100 or whatever, $100 core game. Take a risk when I might not like it. I know the dream world is that young gamers can't afford anything and want everything for free, but I always thought DLC was the lesser of all the evils. Quite a few things to kind of address here. I'll try and do it as neatly as possible. Here's the thing, Season Pass and DLC, theoretically there shouldn't really be a big issue with them, okay? Season Pass is just saying I'm going to support and commit this game for like a year. DLC is just extra content that you can choose to buy or not. So in and of itself, no issue. But Season Passes initially were stuff like Battlefield Premium in Battlefield 3. And I remember at the time saying, and I've said this before, that back then I was just like, yeah, 100%, I'm going to get that. It's a little bit, because remember as well, it's usually discounted if you bought them individually, because you used to be able to buy them individually, whereas with the Season Pass you buy them all together, usually at kind of like a 10 or 15% discount. So you're kind of saying like, yeah, I get it all a little bit cheaper, but I buy it all together. But then they started to do it ahead of time. We saw this with, like, for example, Battlefield 4 and with Hardline. So you can say, oh yeah, I'm going to buy Premium all together in one big box, same as with like Titanfall and things like this. The issue with buying things all together at release as a Season Pass is because you don't know whether that community is going to exist even 1 month after release. And this is what we saw with Battlefield Hardline, was that basically the game wasn't very popular, the game didn't really perform well, it didn't meet expectations, and the community just fell off of a cliff. The player base just disappeared within 2 months even. Which meant that by the time the first DLC even came around, the first content update came around, there wasn't a player base there to play, and people couldn't actually get games on those maps. So then you're in a situation where a company have basically sold you a product that you cannot use. And that is the fundamental problem with season passes, which is that they are selling you content that you do not even know whether you're going to be able to use or not. Now DLCs are a different thing, because DLC, it's just any downloadable content that could be there at release, it could come later. The general thing was that in the past, in days gone by with games, alright, you would play a game, and if you liked that game, the community would be there. Like we're saying with, I always use the example of Company of Heroes. Company of Heroes is a game which is being supported for a long time. Company of Heroes 2 came out in 2013. It's still had recent DLC. The reason being, the community is still there. Same as with Arma. Arma came out 4 years ago. It's still having DLC right now. And so this is the thing. The way DLC, originally worked was, here's your game. If the game remains popular and there's basically, people there that want that content, well then you push it forward a little bit. I always like to think of it as an analogy like driving a car, when you're changing gear. You're going a certain speed, and when you're at that speed and you're staying there and you think, oh, well I could probably change gear now, I can move it up a little bit, bang, you change gear, then you keep going forward, and if you speed, if you're doing well, you think, oh, I can change it up gear again. It's ready for it. It knows that it wants to move, the car, when you're driving along, when you're at a certain speed, you know when it's ready, when the car wants to change gear, when you're going to move it up. Well, adding DLC to games is kind of like that. You start off, the game is ticking along, it's going along. If it maintains a player base and they can see like, oh yeah, well the community's ready, they want that next little stage, add a DLC. If the community's still there later, add a DLC. But otherwise what you're doing is creating tons of content which you don't know if the community is ever going to be there. And then you move to the even more contentious issue of, does content get withheld just so it can be part of a DLC? And this is another issue which ties in with these things. So think about it like this, right? If you're making your game and there's your game, bang, done, right? Ship it out. Then, as I was saying, you see the community's there, maybe 4 or 5 months down the line, community's still loving the game, you put together a DLC, you put a price on it, and you put it out there. Now, the way a lot of modern games have started to go towards, and gamers feel like they've started to go towards, is that instead of doing it in that way, what they do is, because they want to sell a season pass, they have to pre-make the DLCs ahead of time, right? Which means that they want to watch their budget in terms of how much is getting produced so that they can all tie it in, make maximum profit. And so a lot of people have this opinion that content gets withheld from the core game so that it can kind of fill out the DLC package so that they have something to sell as a DLC season pass package. And that is the big problem with season passes and DLCs. And quite honestly, you can't really know where a company is coming from because it's all confidential, it's all withheld within inside the company. Most of the employees will not talk about it, of course, because they're all under NDAs. They can't speak about anything to do with their game. In fact, they often can't speak about anything to do with their game even years after release. So this is the way. We have no real way of knowing what the agenda or the view of the company is, so we can't know how this kind of stuff is going down. And I think probably if people did know, I think it wouldn't be a good truth. Now, we also talked about some different methods of paying for games, whether it's subscription or, not paying, like free-to-play and microtransaction. Captor says, I can't see subscription-based services working out well. In theory, it sounds perfect. In practice, we know studios have no qualms about pulling the game out from under us. Sure, games back in the day might have cost about the same, but developing them was significantly more difficult than it is now. For starters, there were no patches, it had to work from release, forever, not to mention the incredible advances in productivity tools for development. The advances in this field are so great, there's no way I can really approach the topic in a YouTube comment. If it were to be delivered a game which would not be able to be killed off by devs removing servers or subscription services, had no significant bugs or balance problems, required no patching, had well designed and thought out gameplay, darned right I'd pay the inflation adjusted price. However, if they plan to make use of tools like online patches and such which reduce their cost, I expect to see that reduction in cost passed on to the consumer. I actually think that's a really fair and a really good point to make. The idea that, it's not just about the production cost of the game. It's about the support, it's about the way in which they engage with their game in terms of updating it and adding new things to it. And this idea that it's kind of more of a kind of symbiotic relationship between the person purchasing the game and the developer themselves, and they kind of work together in tandem as the game goes along. So yeah, I can see that, and I think that is a fair point to make. However, I don't think it's fundamentally true that subscription models are just seen as being a perfect idea. I mean, I think it's just going to work for some games and not for others. It depends on the intended length of the game, it depends on whether the community remains there for support, but fundamentally I do think that a subscription-based model can work for some things for sure, and I think it does mean that you would be able to see like a lot of good support from a developer, a really, it shows trust and faith between the player, the community, and the developer, because the community is saying like, hey, we want to support you, we want to support this game, we want to support what we're playing and what we're doing here, and the developer in turn would be like, hey, these guys are contributing to us, they're supporting the further creation of content for this game, and therefore we feel secure to put out content and without putting microtransaction systems or other BS, because they're like, we have a direct support from the community. So I think, it swings and roundabouts, but I think it can work. I think it would be interesting to see it applied a little bit more. It'd be interesting to see it applied on a AAA title, like some kind of EA DICE thing. People are going to freak out at the thought of that, but I think it would be interesting. I think it could work, and people hate microtransactions so much. I mean, are you not willing to like have a try and see where things go with it? I mean, WoW has worked for the longest time on a subscription-based system, and it means that they can just add content in and all this kind of stuff. It could work. I think it could be really interesting. Okay, John Clark says, Luton, first time commenting below the line. Okay, games still cost about the same as they did in the past, but people accept gaming much more. In the 90s, a gamer was a kind of nerd. Now this isn't the case anymore. Some people might play games because their friends are playing the same game so that they can be, cool with them. The point is, the games cost less. And in the past, when you give inflation in the equation, far more copies are now sold, so the companies are still making more money than they did in the past, I think is what you meant to say there. So yeah, it's true, but as we have seen, there's a lot of details here, there's a lot of complexity with this. It's not as straightforward as, just they sell more copies now. There is a lot more detail, but it's definitely true that, the gaming community as a whole has exploded and things are bigger than they ever have done before. It's very, very difficult for just your kind of average person to really get their head around this sheer, I guess, the financial elements of the way in which games are produced and how they work. And as I say, there's a lot of detail when it comes to the finances of things. It's like, who decides where a profit margin is? Who decides how much money a company should make? I mean, this is always what I see, is people saying like, oh, they make tons of money. Well, who decides when enough is enough? There's no arbitrary line drawn where it's like, when you get to a certain point, a company isn't capped on how much money it makes. And that's just capitalism. It doesn't work like that. You can't just say, well, they make enough money, so therefore they shouldn't be allowed to put microtransaction systems in the game. It doesn't work like that. That argument is nonsensical, and I see it all the time. People constantly saying, like, hey, oh yeah, they make loads of money, it's not about the games being so expensive to produce, therefore they just automatically shouldn't have microtransaction systems in the game. It doesn't work like that. It doesn't work like that. It doesn't work that you can just argue, well, they make enough money, therefore they shouldn't need to put this in. That isn't how things work. If they can make more money on top, they're just going to do it, right? So the only way, you can't just say, oh, well, we trust them to not put this in the game because, they're making enough. They're going to go, these executives, right, they're going to be sitting around and they're just going to be like, well, guys, we've had a really good year. I think we should just take a break. No needs to make any more money. I think we've made plenty of money. Are you insane? That isn't how these things work. They don't just kind of cap off and just say, oh, well, we've done enough. It'll be all right. Now we're going to turn out a game here which, we're just not concerned whether it makes money or not because we've made enough money already. But ridiculous. It doesn't work that way. They will continue to make as much money as possible. This is how all business works. The only time they are going to change their way of working is when it affects them negatively. All right? Again, it's pretty black and white. If something is working and the numbers add up, they will continue to do it. They don't give a shit about your ethics for games or the community. They don't fucking care about that. What they care about is how much money they're making, right? That's what it's all about. And, you can hate that or not, but it is what it is, right? Now, if it starts to have a negative impact on them, where they're actually making less money or it affects them some other way in terms of bad publicity which won't go away, then they may start to make changes. And that is what we have seen with Star Wars Battlefront. Enough people got annoyed, enough people got pissed off and outraged that it has affected the sales of the game, it has affected the PR situation around EA, and they have had to make embarrassing climb downs around the game. It has affected them very, very negatively. In fact, you can't emphasize enough how badly this game has affected the company. It was an unbelievably poor decision to implement these systems in the game in the way that they did, and it's having profound consequences for them. And that is why you might see some change coming in the future. But again, that then relates to pricing, and maybe they're going to try to make money in other ways. Maybe they'll push the price up a little slowly over time. It's hard to know. Okay, Kresosaurus says, I'd agree for a general price increase from 60 to say 100 if I wouldn't be familiar with quarterly reports from companies like EA and Activision Blizzard indicating profit in the range of billions a year. I would pour them making games cost so much with all the pre-orders, microtransaction DLCs, gold, platinum, diamond editions, season passes. Games haven't costed $60 for a good while now. Again, this highlights just what I was saying. Who is deciding how much money a company makes? Who decides that? Nobody. It doesn't work like that. It doesn't work like that. It's a good point to make in terms of like, yeah, it's $60, but then look at all the other stuff they're doing as well. It's already priced up. But the point that we were discussing about was, if you got rid of all that stuff, would you then see the price go up so that it's still... Do you see what I mean? So you're actually kind of addressing the point that I'm making, which is that they have inflated their prices. They've just done it in a kind of sideways fashion. Okay, Thodin says, I disagree on your sheer volume of content in modern games being the reason for microtransactions argument. We've seen content continuously stripped from games, along with the addition of microtransactions, other marketing gimmicks. The Battlefront series is honestly a good example of this. The original two Battlefront games came with more options than their predecessors and lacked a vast majority of those anti-consumer marketing and microtransaction schemes. Again, it's open to interpretation. I've seen this made a lot of the time, a lot of opinion made about saying, oh, this should have been in the base game, this shouldn't, blah, 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 blah. It's subjective. It's very subjective. The company at the end of the day are making the game. It's up to them what they do with their content. You can have an opinion about whether it should have been in there or not, and I'm not trying to defend them. I'm just making the point that you can't say with any certainty that this game should have had more content and it shouldn't have been DLC. You can't really say that with any certainty. You can only speculate. Soulfire Blue says, Linton, love this segment, keep it up. Sorry for this long comment. Let's be honest, inflation has absolutely taken place in the gaming industry, only it's been disguised, or did they cleverly hide it due to the fact that the price of games hasn't really risen in the past 20-some years? Instead, the amount of content received for that $60 seems to have diminished. Again, it's subjective. It's like when you go to the store for ice cream and instead of raising the price on your favourite half a gallon, they just repackage it to 1.5 quarts, what? And charge you the same. It's still inflation. Your money is getting you less. Now that's the case with a lot of consumer goods now. To this point, the $100 price tag being discussed by these analysts you mentioned doesn't just appear out of thin air. I went to usinflationcalculator.com and lo and behold, the price of a $60 game made in 1995 under normal inflation should cost about $97 today. See? What a shocker. Realistically, I don't think that this point should be dismissed without consideration. If the gaming community is only willing to spend $60 on a new title, should they get upset that they're only getting 3/5 of an actual game? Additional content to fill in the gaps and make the game whole should also cost additional money. You said yourself, graphic design alone is orders of magnitude more advanced than it was. So why did the price never rise? There are many reasons, like the increased popularity of video games in general boomed, leading to record sales over the years. Sonic & Knuckles, according to one source I found, sold 1.24 million copies in the US between 1994 and 2007. IGN reported Electronic Arts revealed Star Wars Battlefront sold 14 million copies across all platforms in 2016 alone. Second, changing technology made it possible to turn out insane profits while providing increased content and better graphics without increasing the price. All this made the gaming community happy as they were getting more bang for their buck. Unfortunately, this artificially stagnant price point conditioned many gamers to expect a complete AAA game for only $60. Unfortunately, developers have begun sacrificing content creation to drive meaningful in-game experience for cheesy addiction-feeding machines, leading to the current state of AAA games, hollow grind machines filled with pretty special effects and slot machines. My point is this, ultimately I think it's going to boil down to both sides determining the price of a gamer's time. Do they pay up front? Do you pay as you go? What if game pricing were based on hours of single-player content available? Say $1 an hour, or I like the idea of subscription model for multiplayer content of say $10 a month, combination of both. Star Wars Battlefront would be a free download. DICE and EA are now incentivized to keep the game fresh for its player base to keep them coming back for resubscription. Now imagine the opposite, a game like Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, would you spend $200 plus on a game with that much content? Whatever the price will be or how it's calculated, I think we as gamers sadly need to relearn the concept that we get what we pay for. Of course, this does not apply to RNG microtransaction BS. But yeah, this is a really well made comment, it's a good point. It really talks to the core of what I'm talking about, which is that you can rationalize it however you like. I know people don't want to stump up and pay the price, but at the end of the day, it is true. You get what you pay for. And also, your resistance to not wanting to pay for content ultimately will have negative implications in one way or another. Because it's like, if you don't want to stump it up, they're going to just try and figure out another way. Cobbler with his delightful bumblebee avatar says, regarding $100 for AAA games, given the massive audience and reach of the marketing, it's safe to say these AAA games are double dipping with their consumers, especially if the game is a well-known brand like Star Wars. Of course, it'll sell like hotcakes, but is that enough for EA or the AAA industry? Nope, it's never enough for them, unless they can proudly proclaim that they're going to beat Call of Duty or they were the biggest selling game of 2017. This might be controversial, but I feel like with mid-tier and niche games, I'm less against the idea of MTS, as much as I wouldn't want them, and one of the appeals of certain mid-tier games is the lack of MTS. I feel like given their lack of mass audience and marketing reach, these mid-tier devs and publishers have more of a reason to charge players more than not at all. For me, this applies to the strategy genre. Grand strategy games from Paradox, RTS games like Company of Heroes or Total War and others seem to be less malevolent than, say, Battlefront or Fallout or Call of Duty on the reason that they're not going to be surefire multi-million hits. I feel less dirty buying factions, commanders, skins, etc. from mid-tier games than I do from huge development studio publishers with a ton of backing and guaranteed sales. There's also the fear that I have that mid-tier studios are less stable, more likely to be shut down if a game or two is a financial failure. And unfortunately, I couldn't kind of discern the last bit here. I guess the only exception is with EA. They can shut down a game studio despite them making profits because the devs sold decently but not COD numbers. Not quite sure what that means. But yeah, games from people like Paradox, Relic and Creative Assembly, yeah, they seem to work in a more, I would say, you know, an older school of DLC content. It's less about kind of microtransaction systems, it's more about providing content for the players. And as I said, it kind of almost elicits back to that way in which I spoke about before, where, you know, they know whether the community is there or not, they provide the content for the community when they can see the community is active. This is definitely the case with Company of Heroes. It's definitely the case with Total War, as I'm actually going to talk about today. Okay, Rifty says, as always, LT making excellent points. When it comes to pricing, it's a difficult conversation because so many people want everything for free. When I was a teenager almost 20 years ago, the recommended retail price of a game was $90. Recommended retail price today is still $90. This is in Australia, with some variation for season passes, collector's editions, etc. This is one of the reasons DLC and other forms of revenue never bothered me, because these were the equivalent of a natural inflation to some degree. I think several people seem to be agreeing with this, but there is a line on that too. The one thing I find most frustrating about the conversation is people often target companies they hate with little rationalization. What a shocker that happens in 2017. Example being EA always takes shit. This is true, they are the punching bag for the industry. Not specifically loot boxes that I'm talking about, but people for some reason just love to hate EA. Yet Activision has always been far more aggressive in screwing over players financially. That's because it's to do with their audience. You've got to look at the demographic, you've got to look at the kind of people that are playing those games. People that are going to play EA games, I think, are generally a bit more involved in these kind of conversations. People that play Activision games, they probably, quite honestly, don't give a shit. Okay, Johnny Rivers with a little simple one. He says, I was reading somebody's wish list on GTA 6 about a week ago, so they were talking about a system. It'd almost be like role-playing online. You can be in emergency services or criminal life with rankings, money system. Tweeted that I like the idea while paying $40 base price, monthly subscription then of about $10 to $15 a month. Now, I actually think what I want to refer to there is mainly about the pricing point, because I think that's probably where people would be at. Would you see a game where they're charging like $30 or $40 and then they're asking you to stump up like 10 or 15 per month thereafter? 10 or 15 is probably going to be what, like 8, 12 quid, something like this. Quite personally, it would be very interesting to see how that played out. Because here's the other thing to remember, okay? Let's just use an example of WoW, because it's a long-standing subscription model. With WoW, they were asking, I think, like about £15 a month or something. But here's the thing. You actually didn't really get a lot of extra content there, okay? With WoW, they would add stuff in. They would add some small things. I think it's changed a little now. But back in the day, it was like, you know, they didn't really add huge content patches for free. You'd be paying that subscription model to play the game, play on the servers, etc. And then when they did do a big update, okay, when they would do a big update, you still have to pay for it as well. So you'd still have to pay for that DLC update. in order to get the extra content. So it wasn't like suddenly, oh yeah, there's no microtransactions and you get content for free for paying your monthly subscription. Now I think if they were going to implement that now into a AAA title, if for example, imagine just say Battlefield, if Battlefield had a subscription-based system, which I know people are a bit controversial, but I think personally, I could see it working. And I know people are going to sort of freak out and lose their minds, but quite honestly, I hate season passes, I hate the current DLC system and the way it fragments the community, and I hate microtransactions. So for me personally, I think I could see that working. But what they would have to do is they would have to say, okay, the subscription system is what pays for that extra content, and then we're just going to keep providing further content further down the line. If they were to do that, I could see that work. Okay, Craig Barlow, spot on LT. Developers are at fault as much as the distributor, in this case DICE and EA. I've seen through the BS of EA for years. Their FIFA franchise exploitation of kids buying Ultimate Team Packs was already in place before Battlefront 2 added the casino betting style cards to its player base. FIFA Ultimate Team makes EA 800 million alone each year, so it's understandable that EA want to repeat this process with their other games. I'm a football fan, used to buy FIFA every year, although never went into Ultimate Team, but this year I'm leaning towards PES because I enjoy a game for gameplay, not some recyclable garbage every year using a casino betting style system just to get more money out of the consumer. How I see it, consumers have the power. Simply don't buy EA games, and we have seen this with Battlefront. It's been slow sales. Battlefield 1 was my last EA game that I'm going to be purchasing for a while because EA have ruined Battlefield in my opinion. Less content, no teamwork whatsoever, just a washed out Battlefield compared to others in the franchise. And yeah, a lot of people are feeling the same way. Right, now we come to part 2 of Below the Line. This is where I ask you a topic of discussion for next week's video. You're going to respond down below with comments and thoughts about this discussion, guys, and then I'll pick up the best ones for next week's videos we've seen today. So in today's Below the Line, I want to talk about games which support their releases way down the line. We've seen recently Creative Assembly announce their first DLC for Total War Rome 2, 3 years since the last major update for that game. Now with all the recent talk about microtransaction systems, and then some of us thinking, as we've done here, about the value of games and different ways in which you can pay for games, whether it's as a standard base purchase, a subscription model, or free to play, the way we can purchase, engage and participate in games continues to change and develop. It's clear that the community is fractured when it comes to opinions around microtransaction systems, and also different kinds of purchases. Some people dislike free-to-play models because they usually inherently require some kind of microtransaction system to make them function. But people enjoy the fact they can enjoy a game with basically no financial investment from themselves, should they choose to, and often a player base is almost then guaranteed for people who want to enjoy the title long term. Subscription models are often enjoyed by games which exist with a roadmap of long-term commitment from a developer, which again can help to solidify a community because the developer and player are committing to the game in question. Subscription-based games often rarely are going to see any sort of questionable microtransaction system because in theory the payment from players means these systems are just not required. Now we see Creative Assembly following suit with other developers like Relic and their Company of Heroes series, returning to give support to a game which I think many would have assumed was not on their agenda for an update. Creative Assembly said in regards to Rome 2's update, "It's the first time we've gone back to a game so long after release. That in itself is very new territory and something we're keen to explore as a studio, because it opens up lots of exciting future projects, if it's successful. There's a lot of people still playing this particular game, but there's also a lot more we haven't even touched in that era yet. Some really incredible stories and events that defined history." Now this DLC, Empire Divided, is going to be charged at $15, £12 as this DLC for Total War Rome 2. You can play as 10 factions split across 5 cultures. Empire Divided looks at the fragmented Roman Empire and the collapse of social order across territories, and it's going to be interesting to see how this update is received by the player base of Rome 2, which still exists with many thousands of regular players. This is laudable for CA to push out an update for a game which is now several releases behind the most recent offering of Total War Warhammer 2, especially when you consider that while the Total War franchise has largely retained continuity of its style, the newer Warhammer games are markedly different from its traditional historical fare. So their decision to look back at a game that they see still has a thriving player base and say, hey, we want to reward that player base with something and we aren't even sure how successful it's going to be, but we want to put it out there anyway. That to me is greatly positive. We've seen support with other games that engage their community over a long period of time. The most notable to me is always Company of Heroes 2, a game that's still going strong despite being released in 2013, similarly to Rome 2. Arma, also 4 years out the gate, still having DLC released, with one coming very soon, and you still got the classics like WoW and StarCraft also fitting the bill. There's a lot of games out there which do support content over time, but it's interesting to see a developer not just support over time, but to go back, revisit and go, hey look, there is a thriving community here, you know, we want to support that. So what's the talking point today? Ultimately it is, should developers look into supporting games post-release over a longer period of time more often? I know your immediate response is just going to say, yes, absolutely. But what I'm really saying here is, does supporting a game post-release for years down the line create a better community for a series? Again, you're probably going to think yes. Probably because I would like to see this too. But look, think of a game like Battlefield 4. Many people talk always about Bad Company, but look, Battlefield 4, you could very much see a new map pack come out for that game. Imagine how that would reinvigorate the community. Or what if they, for example, heavily discounted the other packs for BF4 at this point, really heavily? And what about if they made them, say, even some of them free, released a new map pack alongside that as a DLC? Imagine how that would redevelop and create a really strong community there. A community which maybe would be more willing to come into their new games and create like a good core sentiment there. It's an interesting thought. I'd like to have this discussed a bit more, so tell me what you think about it down below. As always, guys, next episode of Below the Line returns, of course, next week, hopefully this time on Wednesday. See you then.